Imagine this. You're 12 years old, looking out the window of a stone tower in London as the summer sun sets in the year 1483. You were supposed to be king. Your father, the king, is dead. Your uncle brought you here, to the Tower of London, for your protection until your coronation. Soon, your 9-year-old brother joins you. At first, you're seen playing in the castle grounds. But then, day by day, you're seen less and less, until you're not seen at all. You just vanish. History is full of stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But some stories never really end. Their ghosts hang around, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. These are the cases that defy a simple explanation, where the truth is buried under centuries of rumor, speculation, and fear. They remind us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are real, and that sometimes justice is a ghost too. Today, we're reopening the files on 3 of history's most unsettling mysteries. We'll travel from the bloody politics of medieval England to the gaslit, fog-choked streets of Victorian London. And finally, to a crime that gripped America and shattered its sense of security. These are the stories that will stay with you long after this video is over. A royal whodunit, a story of ambition, betrayal, and 2 children who disappeared from one of the most secure fortresses on Earth. The year is 1483, and England is in turmoil. King Edward IV has died suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son, also named Edward, as the heir to the throne. The young Edward V is a boy, not a man, and in the brutal world of 15th century politics, that makes him a target. His protector is his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was his father's most loyal brother and a celebrated military commander, entrusted with safeguarding the young king. He intercepts the royal party on its way to London and brings the young king to the Tower of London, which was both a royal palace and a state prison. The official reason was to prepare for the coronation. Soon after, Richard convinces his widowed sister-in-law to let her younger son, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, join his brother in the tower. This is where the official story starts to fall apart. An Italian friar named Dominic Mancini, who was in London at the time, reported that the 2 brothers were taken into the inner apartments of the tower and then were seen less and less, until they disappeared completely. While the boys were fading from public view, a political earthquake was shaking London. Richard's allies began to build a shocking public case that King Edward IV's marriage to the boys' mother had been false. This meant that their children, including the 2 princes, were illegitimate and had no claim to the throne. With the rightful heirs sidelined, the path was clear. The protector Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. The boys were never seen again. Suspicion immediately fell on the man who had the most to gain from their disappearance, the new king. A rebellion even sprang up that autumn, initially aiming to restore the princes, which suggests many believed they were still alive and being held unjustly. But as the years passed, a darker narrative took hold, one solidified by Tudor historians after Richard III was killed in battle. The most famous account comes from Sir Thomas More, who wrote decades later that Richard III had ordered a loyal servant, Sir James Tyrrell, to murder the boys. According to More's history, Tyrrell confessed years later before his own execution in 1502, admitting he had instructed 2 men to smother the princes with their pillows as they slept. This version of events was famously dramatized by William Shakespeare, cementing Richard III's reputation for centuries as a monstrous, power-hungry tyrant. For hundreds of years, that was the story. The villain was clear. But is it the truth? Here's where the mystery gets complicated. The primary sources accusing Richard were written under the reign of his rivals, the Tudors, who had a vested interest in painting him as a villain to legitimize their own rule. Richard's defenders, known as Ricardians, argue that it made no political sense for him to murder the princes and hide their bodies. They believe that to truly secure his throne, he would have needed to prove their deaths publicly to crush any hope for rebellion. Killing them in secret only created a dangerous mystery that could be used against him. The case took a dramatic turn in 1674. Workmen at the Tower of London, digging at the base of a staircase, unearthed a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 small children. Believed to be the long-lost princes, the remains were given a royal burial in Westminster Abbey by order of King Charles II. For many, this closed the book. but a 1933 examination of the bones was inconclusive, unable to definitively determine their age, sex, or cause of death. To this day, the remains haven't been re-examined with modern DNA technology, leaving a crucial piece of physical evidence in limbo. So if not Richard III, then who? Another figure sometimes suggested is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. He was Richard's right-hand man, instrumental in his rise to power. But just months after Richard became king, Buckingham led a rebellion against him and was executed. Could Buckingham have murdered the princes on his own initiative, hoping to frame Richard and destabilize his reign? A Portuguese document from the era has been interpreted by some as placing the boys in Buckingham's care, potentially giving him both motive and opportunity, though this is a point of debate among historians. Another suspect is Henry Tudor, the man who would eventually defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field and become King Henry VII. He certainly had a motive, as any living heir from the House of York was a threat to his own shaky claim to the throne. However, he was out of the country when the boys disappeared, so he could likely have only ordered their deaths after he became king. But the most radical theory, one that has gained a lot of attention in recent years, is that the princes were never murdered at all. This is the focus of the Missing Princes Project, a historical cold case investigation led by Philippa Langley, the same historian who located Richard III's remains under a Leicester car park. Her team has scoured European archives, uncovering documents that they claim are proof of life. Their controversial research suggests there's no record from Richard III's reign of the boys' deaths, and that the murder story only began circulating after Henry Tudor invaded England. They've found letters and financial records from courts across Europe that they argue refer to the princes being alive long after they vanished. One document they point to, a receipt from a French archive in 1487, has led them to suggest the elder prince, Edward V, may have been leading a military force years after he was presumed dead. This theory recasts the two famous pretenders who later challenged Henry VII, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, not as imposters, but possibly as the real princes trying to reclaim their birthright. This view, however, directly challenges the overwhelming historical consensus. Mainstream historians remain deeply skeptical of these claims, pointing out that the evidence is open to interpretation and not definitive proof. However, in late 2024, a different kind of clue surfaced that points the finger back toward Richard's circle. A registry copy of a will from 1516 was found in which a woman bequeaths her son a very specific item, a chain of office that belonged to young King Edward V. The woman was the sister-in-law of Sir James Tyrrell, the very man Thomas More accused of being the killer. Why would a relative of Richard III's alleged henchman possess such a personal item belonging to the dead prince, 33 years after he disappeared? For some, that detail feels like a grim trophy. And so, the mystery endures. Were two young boys murdered in a cold stone tower on the orders of their ambitious uncle? Were they pawns in a deeper political game, killed by another powerful man? Or did they escape, living out their lives under new names, forever lost to history? The Tower of London holds its secrets tight, and the ghosts of the two princes refuse to go away. We're going to the autumn of 1888, to the district of Whitechapel. It was a place of crushing poverty, dimly lit alleys, and a thick, suffocating fog that seemed to swallow both sound and light. And in this oppressive atmosphere, a new kind of terror was born. A killer who wasn't just a murderer, but a phantom, a butcher, and a legend. He was given a name in a letter sent to the press, a name that would become synonymous with unsolved evil, Jack the Ripper. The nightmare began in August 1888. The victims were women working the streets of the East End, living on the absolute fringes of society, making them vulnerable and easily forgotten. The first, Marian Nichols, was found with her throat slashed, but it was the murder of the second victim, Annie Chapman, in early September, that revealed the true horror of what was unfolding. Her body wasn't just killed, it was brutally mutilated with a terrifying degree of anatomical knowledge. The killer had surgically removed her uterus. Panic gripped London. The police were overwhelmed, dealing with a kind of crime they had never seen before. Over the next few months, the killer struck again. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both murdered on the same night, in what became known as the double event. Stride was found with her throat cut, but it's believed the killer was interrupted before he could perform his ritual mutilation. He wasn't deterred. Less than an hour later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered. She had been subjected to horrific facial disfigurement and abdominal mutilations, with her left kidney and part of her uterus taken. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, suffered the most gruesome fate. She was killed indoors, in her own room, which gave the killer an unprecedented amount of time. The crime scene was a slaughterhouse. Her body was so extensively mutilated that she was barely recognizable. Then, as suddenly as it began, the killing spree stopped. The canonical 5 murders took place over about 10 weeks, and then silence. The investigation was massive for its time. Police interviewed thousands and investigated hundreds of suspects, but they were hamstrung by the forensic limits of the era. There was no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis. The killer moved like a ghost through a district of over 1 million people, a maze of crowded tenements and dark, winding streets. The Ripper's legend was fueled by a series of letters sent to police and the Central News Agency. Most were hoaxes, but 2 stand out. The Dear Boss letter, which first used the name Jack the Ripper, and the From Hell letter. This second one was sent to the leader of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, George Lusk. It arrived in a small box containing half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits. The author claimed to have fried and eaten the other half. Chillingly, Catherine Eddowes' left kidney had been removed by her killer. The authenticity of these letters is still debated, but they cemented the killer's terrifying persona in the public imagination. With no culprit, theories flourished. Was the Ripper a doctor or a butcher, someone with surgical skill? Was he a madman, or a methodical and cunning predator? Suspects ranged from the plausible to the absurd, including a barrister found drowned in the Thames, a convicted poisoner, and even a member of the royal family. But one name consistently appeared in the private notes of the lead investigators, Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a barber in Whitechapel. He suffered from severe mental illness and had a documented hatred of women. A memo written in 1894 by Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnaghten named Kosminski as a prime suspect, stating he was identified by a witness, but there wasn't enough evidence to take him to trial. Kosminski was eventually committed to a mental asylum, where he died in 1919. For over a century, he was just one name on a long list of maybes. Then came the 21st century and the promise of DNA. Modern investigations have focused on a silk shawl, which was said to have been found by the body of Catherine Eddowes. In 2014, author and amateur investigator Russell Edwards, who owned the shawl, claimed that DNA analysis had finally solved the case. Scientists he hired reported they had extracted mitochondrial DNA from stains on the shawl. They claimed a match between DNA from bloodstains and a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes, and more sensationally, a match between DNA from semen stains and a living relative of Aaron Kosminski. The headlines were explosive. Jack the Ripper's identity revealed. Edwards declared that Kosminski was definitely, categorically, and absolutely the killer. But here's the twist that keeps this case from being closed. Almost immediately, the DNA evidence came under heavy fire. Critics pointed out that the shawl's history was poorly documented. Who had handled it over the past 130-plus years? Contamination was a huge risk, and the type of DNA tested, mitochondrial DNA, isn't unique to one person. It's passed down the maternal line, meaning it can be shared by thousands of people. One expert bluntly stated you can only exclude a suspect with this kind of DNA, not definitively identify one. Even if the DNA is from Kosminski, does it prove he was the murderer? Or could it just mean he'd had contact with Eddowes, a sex worker, at some point? The scientific community remains deeply divided, and the study has been widely criticized for its methods. To this day, the shawl evidence is widely considered too compromised to be definitive. So, was Jack the Ripper Aaron Kosminski, a mentally ill barber whose rage exploded in a brief, horrific spree before he was locked away? Or was he someone else entirely, a man who got away with his crimes and took his secret to the grave? The evidence is tantalizing, but it's not proof. Jack the Ripper was never caught, never tried, and never punished. He simply dissolved back into the London fog, leaving a legacy of terror and a mystery that continues to fascinate and horrify us. This case takes us across the Atlantic to the United States for a crime so shocking it was immediately dubbed the crime of the century. This story isn't from the distant past, but from 1932, an era of gangsters, radio, and new American heroes. And no hero was bigger than Charles Lindbergh. In 1927, Lucky Lindy became a global icon by making the first solo, nonstop flight across the Atlantic. He was the embodiment of American courage. He and his wife, and Maura Lindbergh, were America's royal couple. So when their 20-month-old son, Charles Jr., was abducted from their new home in rural New Jersey on the night of March 1, 1932, the nation plunged into a state of collective panic. The scene itself was eerily quiet. The baby was taken from his second-floor nursery. A crude homemade wooden ladder was found outside, broken. On the windowsill sat a note demanding $50,000. It was riddled with grammatical errors and strange spellings, suggesting a German author. What followed was a media circus and one of the largest manhunts in American history. Charles Lindbergh himself took charge of the investigation, often sidelining the police. He used a go-between, a retired school principal named Dr. John Condon, to contact the kidnappers. Through a series of bizarre newspaper ads and secret meetings in cemeteries, Condon communicated with a man who called himself John. Lindbergh, waiting nearby during one meeting, heard the man's voice call out, a detail that would later become critical. The ransom was eventually paid, but the baby wasn't returned. The nation held its breath. Then, on May 12, 1932, the agonizing wait came to a tragic end. A toddler's body was discovered in the woods just a few miles from the Lindbergh home. The child had been dead for about 2 months and died from a massive skull fracture. The heartbreak was immense, but the search for a missing child now became a hunt for a killer. The investigation stalled for 2 years. The breakthrough came in September 1934 when a marked gold certificate from the ransom money was used to pay for gas in New York City. The gas station attendant wrote down the license plate, leading police to a German immigrant carpenter in the Bronx, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. When police searched Hauptmann's home, the evidence seemed overwhelming. They found over $14,000 of the ransom money hidden in his garage. They found Dr. Condon's address and phone number written on a closet door. Hauptmann had a criminal record in Germany that included using a ladder in a burglary. But the prosecution's star piece of evidence was the ladder itself. A wood expert testified that a piece of wood used to build the ladder, rail 16, was a perfect match to a floorboard missing from Hauptmann's attic. The nail holes even lined up. For the jury, this was the smoking gun. Hauptmann's handwriting was also said to match the ransom notes. And at the trial, both Charles Lindbergh and Dr. Condon identified Hauptmann as the man they had heard and met in the cemetery. Hauptmann, for his part, maintained his innocence until the very end. He claimed the money was left with him by a friend, Isidor Fisch, who had since returned to Germany and died. He alleged that police beat him and forced him to provide handwriting samples. Despite his pleas, the jury found him guilty. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair. Case closed? Not for everyone. In the decades since, serious doubts have been raised about whether Hauptmann was guilty, or at least if he acted alone. The case against him was largely circumstantial. No fingerprints of his were found at the scene. Witnesses like Lindbergh and Condon had at first failed to identify Hauptmann in lineups. Many believe the trial was a media-fueled spectacle and that Hauptmann, a German immigrant with a criminal past, was the perfect scapegoat. So if Hauptmann wasn't the lone killer, what really happened? One theory is that it was an inside job. Suspicion fell on several members of the Lindbergh household staff, particularly a maid named Violet Sharp, who died by suicide after intense police questioning. But in recent years, an even more disturbing and controversial theory has been put forward by some researchers, one that is not accepted by mainstream historians. This fringe theory points the finger at the most unthinkable suspect, Charles Lindbergh himself. Proponents of this theory point to Lindbergh's well-known interest in eugenics, a discredited movement focused on improving the human race. The Lindbergh baby was reportedly sickly, with a larger-than-normal head and other health issues. They speculate that Lindbergh, a hero obsessed with strength and perfection, may have seen his son as flawed and allowed him to be used in a dangerous experimental surgery by his colleague, the Nobel-winning surgeon and fellow eugenics proponent Alexis Carrel. The theory goes that the experiment went wrong, and the kidnapping was an elaborate cover-up. Supporters point to claims that some of the baby's organs were missing and that there was little blood at the scene, suggesting a medical procedure. However, these claims are fiercely disputed, with most experts attributing the body's condition to natural decomposition and animal activity. It's also been claimed that Lindbergh insisted on a quick cremation and discouraged further scientific testing. Whether this was an act of a grieving father or someone concealing a secret is still debated. To this day, Hauptmann's descendants and advocates for his innocence are still fighting to get key evidence, like saliva from the ransom note envelopes, tested with modern DNA technology, but their requests have so far been denied. So we're left with a haunting set of possibilities. Was Bruno Hauptmann a monstrous killer who acted alone? Was he an unlucky patsy, framed for a crime he didn't commit? Or was the crime of the century a dark family secret, a cover-up orchestrated by one of America's greatest heroes? The man who was executed for the crime insisted on his innocence to his dying breath, leaving a shadow of doubt that time has not been able to erase. 3 cases, separated by centuries, but united by a chilling lack of closure. The princes who vanished, the phantom of Whitechapel, and the hero's fallen son. Each story leaves us with more questions than answers, and the truth remains just out of reach. What do you think really happened? Was Richard III a villain, or a victim of masterful propaganda? Is the DNA evidence on that old shawl enough to finally name Jack the Ripper? And could an American hero have been capable of such a monstrous deception? Drop your theories in the comments below. History is written by the victors, but it's haunted by the victims whose stories are never finished. The mysteries of the princes in the tower, Jack the Ripper, and the Lindbergh baby endure not just because they are unsolved, but because they expose the fragility of life, the darkness of human nature, and the terrifying possibility that sometimes the truth is lost forever. They are grim reminders that some cases never truly close. They just fade into history, waiting for a clue that may never come. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting thought of all. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. It really helps more people see it. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. We've got lots of interesting and eerie stories on deck, and I'd love for you to be part of this community of case solvers. Until next time, keep the lights on, stay alert, and stay out of the shadows.